When I imagine a civil discourse with a right-winger, it's a structured debate about facts and how to interpret those facts. Like when I'd say, maybe we should introduce the concept of democracy in the workplace and push for worker co-ops. They'd respond with something like, who would provide the initial capital? And the conversation would progress thusly, with relevant points and counterpoints based on empirical facts, or at very least an arguably valid epistemological or axiomatic concept. Instead, what I tend to get is a barrage of hyperbolic conspiracy theories with the least charitable interpretations possible. The left doesn't just want a fair shake for laborers, no. They're just jealous of the power of the rich and want to abolish private and personal property so they can enact a globalist communist dictatorship where everyone is forced to do free labor for the party in gulags. The left doesn't just want trans and non-binary people to be treated fairly or be acknowledged. No, it's a plot by a cabal of elitist Hollywood pedophiles that want to transition children and parade them around at drag shows and destroy masculinity so American men will fall to some foreign boogeyman. Apparently the left doesn't just think you should be considerate towards the plight of others and acknowledge society still isn't affording equal opportunity. No, it couldn't possibly be that reasonable. They want equality of outcomes and to outlaw individualism, or to destroy free speech and use intersectionality to destroy Western culture on behalf of Jeff Bezos, or some convoluted nonsense. They have to attack a strawman version of leftist arguments using slippery slopes and genetic fallacies, because there is little in actual leftist policy they can sink their teeth into. And a prime example of this is PragerU. For those of you who don't know, PragerU is the one university where attendance actually makes you less educated. It's a right-wing propaganda media company, not actually a university, founded by former obscure talk show host Dennis Prager and his buddy. Here's a video they recently produced titled, How the Left Sees the World, Power, Race, and Class.
Why does the left hate Israel? On the surface, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I agree. The claim that the left hates Israel doesn't make sense. Saying they have some criticisms of Israel's policies, I think would make a lot more sense.
Israel is a liberal democracy. It extends full rights to women, to gays, and to its many Arab citizens.
Wait, which side of the 25-foot walls are we talking about?
Like all countries which are made up of flawed human beings, Israel is flawed. But compared to most countries, not to mention its neighbors, it is a civil rights paradise.
Compared to the worst examples we can find, we're doing good. What an astounding argument. And it's hard to call something a civil rights paradise when they're actively accused of apartheid.
So why does the left hate Israel? The reason is that the left, and as I always emphasize, I am talking about the left, not about liberals, is not guided by a moral compass. It is guided by three other compasses: a power compass, a race compass, and a class compass. Let's begin with the power compass.
Oh yes, I'm sure the people who make ethical arguments for spreading funds to those in need have no moral compass. Like, how can you claim you're having an intellectually honest, good faith conversation when you start with a blatant over-the-top ad hom straw man like, my opponent has no moral compass? Like, even when I disagree with somebody, I'm typically charitable enough to grant them that they actually believe somehow their idea is going to be best for everyone.
Instead of evaluating people and nations on the basis of right and wrong or good and evil, the left evaluates them on the basis of weak and strong. If you're weak, you're good. If you're strong, you're bad. Israel is strong, therefore it is bad. America is strong, therefore it is bad.
Oh, well, it definitely couldn't have anything to do with legitimate criticisms of Israeli and American foreign and domestic policy. Surely America unilaterally declaring war on nations on false evidence, propping up dictators and meddling in democratic elections, none of these things come into play. They're just bad because they're strong. This is the oversimplified justification a narcissist comes up with to deflect criticism. They don't hate me because I use my strength to bully people. They're just jealous that I'm strong.
The Palestinians are regarded as weak. Therefore, they're good. When you're guided by a moral compass, you don't ask who's strong and who's weak. You ask who's morally right and who's morally wrong.
I've always said there are no good guys in this conflict. There are just two bad guys who won't acknowledge the other's right to self-determination or to even exist. You're kidding yourself if you think you could suss out who the moral superior is in that conflict. But anybody who believes they know who the good guy is has come to that belief through some sort of moral lens. You can't define good and evil without one. People who focus on the terrorist attacks by Hamas would sympathize with Israel. People who focus on the annexation and reports of human rights abuses would sympathize with Palestine. It's understandable that Zionists wanted a home state, and it's understandable that the Palestinians would be upset that colonialists just plopped another nation in the middle of where they had lived by fiat. But you don't need to focus on one or the other. Both of them have failed to meet deadlines, and both of them have been accused of not giving any headway at the negotiation table. That being said, nobody would reduce the argument to such absurd simplicity as strong bad, weak good, with no regard for actions, intents, or outcomes.
50 years ago, Israel was not a big issue for the left. Why? Because it was perceived as weak. But after the 1967 Six-Day War, in which Israel achieved a stunning military victory, it all changed. Israel became strong, so Israel became bad. And the Palestinians were weak, so they became good.
Well, no, that's not true at all. Certainly the Palestinians weren't happy about it back in '48. And there were a lot of people before Israel even formed that thought the whole thing was a bad idea, a powder keg waiting to explode, and an unethical reappropriation of land. George C. Marshall opposed it. Woodrow Wilson's King Crane Commission reported that the Arab majority feared Zionism would lead to an exclusively Jewish state and the dispossession of Palestine. Albert Einstein believed in a two-state solution, but resisted the idea of having borders or an army, and would later criticize the Harut Party and the IZL. But that's beside the point. Nobody suddenly thought Israel was bad because they were strong. They have individual grievances with things they did. In 2003, a commission created by their own Israeli government ended up reporting that the handling of the Arab sectors was discriminatory. It's not having power that's bad, it's how you wield it.
So no matter how much terror Palestinians engaged in, hijacking airplanes, murdering 11 Israeli athletes and coaches at the 1972 Munich Olympics, blowing up Israelis in pizza parlors and at weddings, the left's position never changed. Palestinians good, Israel bad.
Again, nobody in the real world has this brain-dead take. I've never once heard a sane leftist say, terrorism good, hooray for hijackings! Because nobody thinks terrorist groups are good, save for their sympathizers, which are basically just terrorists without the motivation. However, I have heard people on the left analyze and comprehend the chain of events that lead to these actions. You can comprehend why a smaller force engaged in unilateral warfare would stoop to desperate measures without condoning those measures. And it's the right wing that's usually cheering on the use of force. You'll notice how Prager mentions the misdeeds of Hamas, which are terrible, but no mention of anything Israel or America has done. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch acknowledge a 50-year process of human rights abuses by the Israeli state. We know that Israel has set death squads to take out their enemies in unlawful clandestine operations, and we know that they've been building settlements to annex territory they have been repeatedly told by international authorities isn't theirs. It's wrong to lash out, but it's also wrong to oppress. See that, Prager? My conclusion has nothing to do with the dynamics of power. I consider them both wrong through moral judgments.
That's one of the three ways the left judges the world. You can test this theory in other ways. Why is the United States bad? Because it's strong.
Is he really implying that America has never done anything worthy of moral criticism? America has a history of oppressing people, wiping their asses with treaties, meddling in everyone else's business, and general bad faith dealings. It's not their strength, it's how they've historically chosen to use it. America has done some good as well, but name another country that has military bases in almost every country on Earth, and then tell me how many countries have a military base in America.
And third world countries that oppose the United States are good. Cuba, for example, has been adored by the left for decades. Never mind that Cuba's Communist Party has ruined Cuba, that Cubans have no civil rights, and Cuba is one of the poorest countries in the world.
The constant threat of espionage incentivizes nations to become authoritarian hermits. And since the Truman Doctrine, the United States and its allies have openly declared that they would oppose and generally harass any nation making any attempt to be communist, even if it's of their own democratic volition. I can't say that it's all America's fault, but being a tiny island nation off the coast of an overtly antagonistic superpower isn't helping to loosen them up. Same goes with their poverty. American sanctions for the last half a century probably could account for that. However, despite it, they report their poverty level as the 6th lowest in the developing world, 4th in Latin America, and 48th amongst all countries. So I don't think that really qualifies them as one of the poorest countries in the world when there's like 140 countries behind them. And there are those who would contest that the Communist Party ruined Cuba, but a lot of people who lived during the Batista era vehemently claim that Castro saved them. A lot of people who fled to America, at the time called Gusanos, would say that it was a terribly oppressive place and they had to escape. Many of them were capital holders who would obviously have a bias against the transition. For everyone you can find that says they ruined Cuba, you can find somebody who was actually kind of happy with it.
Since Cuba is weak, to the left, Cuba is good. The same was true with North Vietnam in the 1960s. It was considered weak, so it was good. The U.S. was strong, so it was bad. It didn't matter that America was trying to preserve the freedom of the South Vietnamese exactly as it had preserved the freedom of the South Koreans.
Whoa, you just skimmed past a whole lot that needs to be unpacked there. The Vietnam and Korean Wars were actually pretty different. First of all, it was the Northern Viet Cong that were considered the strong ones. That's why America got involved. After the Japanese overthrew the French, the Emperor abdicated and the DRV took over most of Vietnam. It was the British who came in and forced the French back into power and propped up the Emperor again in the South. The Viet Minh of the North were seen as a Vietnamese liberating team, while the South was seen as a puppet regime of colonialists. At the Geneva Convention, the Viet Minh agreed to divide the country and have an election for reunification. The people would democratically decide, and the DRV was confident that the people would choose the socialists, under Ho Chi Minh, over the Emperor and the French. It fell apart, though, when the South Vietnamese premier suddenly rejected the agreement and publicly announced that the South would not participate in the election. They claimed the North would not conduct a fair election, even though at the same time in that same year, the South blatantly rigged an election in which 133% of the population voted in a new prime minister with 98% of the vote. The South already attempted a coup on Ho Chi Minh as well in 1946. Representatives of other countries offered to oversee the elections, but even they concluded that a fair election was unlikely. Now, don't get me wrong, the North were not the good guys, but neither were the South. The South, which promised to engage in land reform using American funding, canceled the project because the corrupt president's biggest supporters were landowners. They kept the money, though. They were also a very repressive regime, and they killed Buddhists by the hundreds. More and more South Vietnamese were defecting because they didn't see the Viet Cong as being any worse. And to bring this back to America, they lied about the Gulf of Tonkin just to justify their meddling. None of these are good guy things to do. As for Korea, the conditions were different, but both the North and the South were run by a militaristic authoritarian dictator. Both sides wanted to reunify the nation under their own banner, and both had attempted invasions of the other prior to the June 25th surprise attack. We weren't preserving freedom, we were backing dictators. Neither one of them were good guys, we just took the anti-communist dictator's side. And ironically, I could argue that the anti-communists don't have a moral compass, and instead use the threat to capitalist profit margins as a compass. Because America has backed a lot of horrible dictators, as long as they're not socialists. What sort of moral compass would allow that?
The U.S. was strong, so it was bad. Which brings us back to Israel. The stronger Israel gets, as it effectively defends itself, as its economy grows, and as its diplomatic position improves, the more the left hates it.
Again, how delusional would you have to be to think that leftists hate you because you're successful, and not because you're doing ethically questionable things? Nordic countries are successful, economically well off, they're diplomatically well liked, yet leftists adore them. Maybe it's because they don't have a reputation for shenanigans. Maybe leftists like Sweden and Finland because they are economically left of America and are a better moral example.
The second of the left's compasses, the race compass, is another reason the left hates Israel. Just as it substitutes weak and strong for good and evil, the left substitutes non-white and white for good and evil. The left doesn't judge people by their actions, but by their race.
Do they really, though? You sure this isn't just a hyperbolic straw man based on the most insane Twitter posts from teenagers that you could dig up? What sane leftist thinks that evil lives in the skin, or a lack of melanin produces evil? I've heard leftists talk about how everyone inadvertently carries racial biases, or how the culture supports some biases, but I don't hear them saying that every individual white person is bad and every individual person of color is good. It seems to me, Prager, it is you that has a comprehension problem when it comes to this.
That's why, for example, the left asserts that a black person cannot be a racist. Only a white person can be a racist.
Well, this is just a semantics problem, because what you call racism, they call racial prejudice. Either both are racist or both are prejudiced. Either way, you're describing the same thing. Your problem isn't with the concept, it's with the wording. When they say that black people can't be racist, it's in their definition of the word that they believe racism means prejudice plus power, meaning that people of color can and do have racial prejudices, but do not have the power to engage in using that to oppress people. Personally, I think it's a lame definition, as racism without power is still racism, And we already have a term for prejudice plus power. It's racial oppression. But no matter which term you use, no rational person is implying a person of color can't have racial prejudices.
And that provides the second reason Israel is labeled evil. Israelis are considered white, and Palestinians are not white. Never mind that more than half of Israel's population is not white.
Wow, way to undermine your own premise there, Prager. Indeed, by American standards, pretty much nobody there is white. They're considered Semitic, which is Syro-Arabian. And if you ask David Duke, he will most definitely tell you how not white they are. So why would leftists hate them for being white when they are ostensibly majority Middle Eastern and face discrimination in the United States as a visible minority?
The result? The left essentially ignores Palestinian terror and loudly condemns Israel's responses to terror. Now to the left's third compass, the class compass. This is the third way in which the left replaces traditional Western and Judeo-Christian categories of good and evil.
Well, first of all, good and evil are subjective terms to begin with. Secondly, Western culture didn't come up with any ethical ideology that wasn't suggested before in some form. Lastly, Judeo-Christian morality is vastly inferior to modern secular humanism. Biblical morality tells us how to ethically beat our slaves and oppress our wives and children. Biblical morality teaches us that failure to kiss God's ass is worse than murder, as the first 4 of the 10 Commandments are all about his ego. If we're going to take the hypocritical and contradictory Judeo-Christian morals, why not just go back to Hammurabi's code?
Instead of judging people's actions by the same moral yardstick, that of good and evil, the left judges people's actions based on their economic class.
Though leftists still judge based on moral standards like everybody else, they're just intelligent enough to acknowledge the externalities that cause people to do evil, while Prager ignores the causes of bad behavior and just focuses on the outcomes. These are the people who put zero mental effort into solving the causes of crime, but instead focus all their effort into punishing the violators, which is akin to getting a cut and then endlessly cleaning up the pools of blood instead of just closing the wound. Like, obviously, stealing is wrong. It is immoral to take what isn't yours. But it becomes more understandable when you find out it's a mother stealing bread to feed her kids. Yes, it's still wrong for her to steal, even if your need is greater than the store owner. But the intention and conditions surrounding something do inform the level of perceived good and evil. So your social class doesn't make stealing okay, but we all understand someone who is well off has less incentive to steal.
Rich people in rich nations are bad, poor people in poor nations are good. This began with Karl Marx, who divided the world by economic class, not moral behavior.
What? I don't believe Prager's read a single word from Marx before. If he did, he would understand that almost the entirety of Marx's criticism of capitalism was based on his moral standard, that exploitation is wrong, and taking the excess wealth generated by laborers without their consent is theft. And how stupid is it to blame Marx for dividing the world by class? He didn't create it, he just pointed it out. Class distinction existed since the first goofball decided that he should be the ruler of the tribe. Up until modern history, most systems revolved around laborers being subservient to landholders that absorbed the wealth produced. It is a moral argument that the workers should themselves decide how the fruits of their labor are reaped, rather than having a de facto king of the workplace decide.
To Marx and to Marxism, good and evil is entirely class-based. Good is defined as workers, evil as owners.
So let me get this straight. According to Prager, if you were to murder Karl Marx and stab him to death, he'd just sit there like, oh, I have no moral opinion on the ethics of this because I don't know how poor you are. Like, give me a break. You're gonna sit there with a straight face and claim that one of the most influential political writers of the time is too stupid to make moral judgments based on deontological or utilitarian ethics? That a man of nuanced analysis would boil everything down to rich bad, poor good? You do realize he made a distinction between the proletariat and the lumpenproletariat, right? If being poor was a moral good, then he would have elevated the lumpenproletariat instead of basically casting it aside as dead weight.
And that is the third reason for the left's hatred of Israel and of America. They are both wealthy.
Luxembourg is one of the most wealthy nations on earth. Where's all the Luxembourg hate? Monaco is super rich. Why don't I hear all the leftists bashing Monaco? Singapore is doing very well. When was the last time anyone on the left mentioned Singapore since that kid got caned for spray painting? Nobody on the left hates you for being wealthy. They hate people who obtained their wealth through unethical, exploitative systems. If you can point me towards an honest, ethical billionaire, I will like them. But good fucking luck. As Balzac ostensibly said, behind every great fortune is an equally great crime.
As fewer and fewer people perceive the world in terms of good and evil, substituting a power, race, or class compass for a moral compass, you will inevitably get more evil.
Well, you're an idiot, Prager, because one's moral compass is what informs them on how issues dealing with power, race, and wealth are either good or bad. You can't say bigotry, the use of force, or hoarding is bad without taking a moral stance. And these are all things that the left are very vocal against. Besides, why would I take advice on morals from a guy that unironically defended spousal rape and answers the question of theodicy by blaming the devil?
And more hatred of the good, beginning with Israel and America, and ending with Western civilization. I'm Dennis Prager.
Oh, there it is. I knew it was coming. End of Western civilization. That's the middle spot on my right-wing lunatic bingo card. This speaks to the conspiratorial exaggerations I spoke of at the start. Right-wing talking heads just can't resist taking something as innocuous as advocating for better race relations and turning it into an existential threat to Western society. It must be tough living in fear of imagined leftist boogeymen all the time.